Welcome to the Area 1 section that we're entitling Did You Know? And our theme for this section is on persecution. Just one of the really important themes that I think we need to ponder and to try to get a handle on if we're going to understand how Christianity grew in these first 300 years up until the time of Constantine, when Christianity becomes a little more official part of the Roman Empire. Persecution is a recurring theme as we think about the growth of the church during its first 300 years. Stephen and James were first generation martyrs. Paul was chased out of cities because of hostility to the gospel. And according to church tradition, he eventually died a martyr's death during the reign of Nero. Tradition says that Peter was killed during that time as well. Indeed, all the early apostles have stories linked to them about where they went and what they did and how they died. And all died as martyrs for the faith according to church tradition. History gives us a few more details about Justin and Origen, Perpetua and Polycarp and Ignatius, among others, and how they died joyfully for their faith, often in the face of angry beasts and angry mobs. But two things that I want us to ponder real briefly. Number one, why were Christians persecuted anyway? What what were some of the reasons behind persecution? And number two, why did Christianity continue to grow in spite of persecution? Well, let's think about the first one first. Why were Christians persecuted anyway? Well, first we need to recognize that there were a variety of causes that fueled the animosity that people felt toward the Christians. To some degree, Christianity was persecuted because it was new and unknown. When Christians talked about the body and blood of the Lord's Supper, Romans heard cannibalism. When Christians talked about celebrating a love feast, a common practice among early believers, Roman citizens heard orgy and debauchery. Such misunderstandings provided fodder for already suspicious Romans. Even more significant, however, was the fact that Christianity challenged the existing Roman system of worshiping the gods. Roman worship was polytheistic, that is, it allowed for a variety of gods. Roman worship was also syncretistic. It made room for new gods to be added to the pantheon. Christianity, with its monotheism and its refusal to recognize the reality of any other god other than the one revealed in Jesus, was seen as a challenge to the Roman system. Because of their exclusive stance and their refusal to participate in the ritual worship to the Roman gods, the Roman establishment perceived that Christians were disloyal citizens and potential threats to national security. Lastly, when we factor in the maniacal personality of several Roman emperors, we have another powerful factor to consider. Nero famously persecuted Christians in and around Rome in the 60s of the first century, blaming them for a fire that he set in Rome for his own personal gain. Interestingly, Christians were already a noted enough minority in Rome 30 years after the death of Jesus to be known and targeted by the emperor. Pretty powerful, I think. Emperor Domitian was one of the first to elevate the emperor to the status of a god and demanded that all good citizens worship the emperor. When Christians refused, many were persecuted. Now, not every emperor was out to get Christians. Some were more concerned about other matters of the empire, and it was during these times of relative peace that Christianity spread rapidly throughout the empire. However, even when there was a more systematic targeting of Christians by emperors like Decius in the 250s and Diocletian in the early 300s, Christianity still prospered. But back to our second question now. How do we account for the growth in spite of times of persecution that Christians experienced? We could talk about this subject for hours. That's not my goal. The simplest explanation is that Christians offered something inviting to the Romans. Christians lived with hope and joy and peace, even in the midst of persecution. The way in which Christians approached death was no doubt a powerful testimony to some. Christians were noted for how they cared for the poor and the sick and the oppressed. There are stories about how Christians during times of plague cared for their sick neighbors and friends when everyone else had fled, leaving behind a powerful testimony. Early Christians were an egalitarian crew. That is to say, Christians challenged many of the social boundaries that existed in Roman society. Men and women, slaves and free, rich and poor, were all invited and welcomed into the Christian community. And finally, within this community, Christians were noted for their love for one another. Many people were abandoned by their families when they converted, but found in the church a new family to replace the old.